Hey, good morning, friends. We're continuing in Nehemiah chapter 13, and this morning we're going to be looking at verses 15 through verse 22. Now, in our last installment, it was kind of a flashback, right? Because we're looking at the portion where Nehemiah returns home after going back to report to Artaxerxes, and then he sees these things that are happening where they had made room for their enemy in the temple. And Nehemiah drives all these things out, reestablishes things back to the way they should have been. Now, the sad thing is, in this latter part of chapter 13, is we're going to see that Nehemiah is going to discover basically an unraveling of sorts. He's established all these things in previous chapters. They've committed, the Israelites have vocally committed themselves to what God has called them to do, to separating from mixing with pagan nations, to doing the service of the temple, making sure that that temple worship is established, that the people that are involved are taken care of, and so forth. All these promises they've made to God, and yet it seems, just like in the book of Judges, as soon as they have the opportunity, they turn away from their promises, they turn away from their commitments, end up falling back into sin. We've talked about this in one of our previous installments as well. So let me read the passage for us in chapter 13. Verse 15 says, "In those days I saw in Judah, people treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in heaps of grain and loading them on donkeys, and also wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them on the day when they sold food. Tyrians also, who lived in the city, brought fish in and all kinds of goods, and sold them on the Sabbath to the people of Judah in Jerusalem itself. Then I confronted the nobles of Judah and said to them, 'What is this evil thing that you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers act in this way? And did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Now you are bringing more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath.' As soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut and gave orders that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. I stationed some of my servants at the gates that no load might be brought in on the Sabbath day. Then the merchants and sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside of Jerusalem once or twice. But I warned them and said to them, why do you lodge outside the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you.' From that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come and guard the gates to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember this also in my favor, O my God, and spare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love." So, what we're seeing here is Nehemiah continuing in his reform efforts in the people of Israel. It's very likely, as verse 15 alludes, in those days, as it says, that this is happening in sequence, in tandem with his return journey back into Jerusalem. He's gone off to make the report. He's come back. He sees this horrible scene before him as they're not taking care of temple worship as they should. So he's got to reestablish that. Then after all that's been taken care of, is it layer upon layer upon layer. Now here's Nehemiah, after he's taken care of the temple situation, now he turns and sees they're not obeying the Sabbath. Remember the three things that they agreed to. They weren't going to intermarry, they were going to keep the Sabbath, and they would promote the temple worship. Nehemiah returns home in chapter 13 after some period of time, how long we're not sure. And what's the first thing he notices? They're not keeping temple worship. The second thing he's going to notice, in the reverse order here, they're not keeping the Sabbath. And then, as what our next installment is going to show us, they're still intermarrying with other people. Remember, they verbally gave their commitments to the Lord in this way. Now we can look at them and say, oh, these hypocrites, these terrible people, except let's take a step back for a second and remember that but for the grace of God, there go I. And I've said this before. This is not a time for us to look at and go, how horrible are these people? What's wrong with them? Why would they do something so stupid? Because we here in the 21st century are looking back at a historical narrative. Friends, in our foolishness, no doubt we would often do the same things. No doubt we do the same things at times, do we not? And we're angry with ourselves. Why did I do this? Why does Paul say in Romans 7, Why is it that I do the things that I shouldn't and then I don't do the things that I should? We all struggle in these areas. And this is just a fleshing out, just a recalling, an illustration to us, as it were, of historical events where these things took place. So as you look at verse 15, in those days I saw in Judah people treading wine presses on the Sabbath, bringing in heaps of grain and loading them on donkeys, and also wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. So they're not keeping the Sabbath at all. In fact, for them, the Sabbath is this extra day to do commerce, which is typically what our world has come into. I mean, I've kind of made a joke in jest that it's funny to me that I don't remember getting packages from UPS or FedEx on a Sunday. But yet, especially within the last year, I've started to notice that happening. I mean, there's no rest. There's no serious look at a time of rest. Now, as New Testament believers, we are not strictly told to keep the Sabbath, but these people were. This is a command from Scripture for them. And they were not obeying God. They were not obeying their commitment to God. They're using this as just another day of business, just another opportunity for us to make money. And as you see at the end of verse 15, and I warned them on the day when they sold food. So Nehemiah is trying to tell them. It seems in the text that he's trying to verbally encourage and exhort them to take a different position, go in a different direction, before he actually goes and does the things that he does in the next pericope here, verses 19 through 22, as we'll get to a little more in depth in a moment. Now, who are the Tyrians? We don't know for sure. Best guess, obviously, these are foreign people coming in from outside of Jerusalem. Okay, now they're living in the city. They're bringing in stuff from the sea, fish and all kinds of goods, and sold them on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. So here's, not only are the people in Jerusalem not obeying God's law, they're encouraging this in other peoples. They're inviting other people to come in, have this marketplace, this, like you see in Somerville and other places, they'll have like the farmers markets on Saturday mornings, that kind of thing. This is what they're doing. They're setting up shop. The Sabbath? What's the Sabbath? I mean, they're just going to do whatever they want. And notice, though, in verse 17, that Nehemiah, this is the second time. Remember, I said there's going to be 3 times that he confronts a group of people. Now he's going to confront the nobles. Verse 17. Then I confronted the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this evil thing that you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers act in this way? Verse 18. And did not our God bring all this disaster on us, on this city? Now you are bringing more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. So the question that might pop up in your head, why does he go to the nobles? Well, the nobles are the ones technically that would be in charge of these kinds of things. The commerce, the mercantile enterprise of Jerusalem here at this time. They could have said something. They would have been somewhat of an authority, someone that people would have looked up to. If they would have said, you know what, we're not doing business, like the CEOs of major corporations, if they were all to say, you know what, we're not doing anything on Sunday, or in their case on the Sabbath, we're not going to do anything on the Sabbath, that would have repercussions. People would fall in line with these people that they look up to, with these bigger people in larger companies, as I kind of relate that to today. So in their time frame, if these men would have stood up and said, we're not going to do any business on the Sabbath, others would have no doubt fallen in line. They would have seen that, whether as from a position of wisdom, or just as seen as like, okay, well, they're not doing it, so I guess I'm not either. But they didn't. In fact, likely they encouraged this kind of enterprise. What's the Sabbath? It's just another day for us to make money. And so Nehemiah confronts them. And he says very pointed words. Don't miss this. What is this evil thing that you are doing? Now you might take a step back and go, yeah, I disagree. I think it's wrong. I don't think they should have been doing this because they made a commitment to God that they wouldn't. But evil? I mean, they're just selling stuff, right? But it's so much more than that. Remember, this is sin. This is disobedience to God's command. What is this evil thing that you are doing? Blatant disregard for obedience to God. And they are profaning the Sabbath, as Nehemiah says in verse 17. You are making a mockery out of a day that God has told us to set aside to worship Him. Remember, that is the key here, guys. It's not about keeping some kind of rule about, okay, we can't do any work, whatever. This is about God saying, you need to set aside time to worship me, especially as it relates to a corporate gathering. And what are they doing? No, that's not important to us. No, the worship of the God who sovereignly is in charge of everything isn't worth my time. That's essentially what they're saying here. And then he follows up with that in verse 18. Did not your fathers act in this way? Hey, guys, history lesson. Previous generations did this to the Lord. And in case you forgot, verse 18 says, and did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Essentially saying, hey, you remember the reason why we kind of went into exile in the first place? This had something to do with it. Probably had a lot to do with it. So help me understand why, now that we've reestablished ourselves in the capital city, why would you want to do the very thing that caused previous generations to be put out? Did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Now he says, you are bringing more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. Guys, look at what you're doing. You are literally going to send us into another exile. You are literally doing the very thing that got us in trouble the first time. You know, and in the words of R.C. Sproul, what's wrong with you people? What is wrong with you guys? And so it appears that Nehemiah doesn't feel like he's getting anywhere. So that's where we turn to verses 19 through 22. It says here, and in those days I saw in Judah, verse 19, and as soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors be shut and gave orders that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. And I stationed some of my servants at the gates that no load might be brought in on the Sabbath day. So Nehemiah is like, look, you know what? If you guys aren't going to voluntarily do what God's commanded you to do and what you said you were going to do, then I'm going to step in and help. And so kind of in another situation of righteous indignation here, here's Nehemiah stepping up to the plate. And before the Sabbath begins for them, which, you know, because their days for evening and morning, he commands all the doors of the gates to be shut. All right, we're shutting down the city. I'm not asking for permission. I'm shutting down the city. And he puts people at the gates and says, do not let anyone go. Well, very likely no one goes out, but especially nothing new comes in. We're not doing this. The Sabbath day is supposed to be holy and reserved to the Lord. We're going to keep that commitment. And if I have to do so physically getting involved, then that's what we're going to do. So he puts people in those places to make sure no one comes in the gates on the Sabbath day. And so the merchants, whether they're apathetic about it or they think there's some kind of mistake going on, in verse 20 we see the merchants are essentially kind of hanging out outside. Now the gates are closed. Okay, well maybe we'll just wait. So some of them start hanging out outside the gate. It says in verse 20, and the merchants and the sellers of all kinds of wares lodge outside Jerusalem once or twice. So it seems as if a pattern is starting to emerge. The first week, okay, that's weird. We'll just hang outside the city. The second week, yeah, it happened again. Yeah, we'll just hang outside the city. But now Nehemiah takes a step further in verse 21. But I warned them and said to them, why do you lodge outside the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. Message received, right? Because what happens then? From that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. Nehemiah puts a stop to this profaning of the Sabbath day. His heart is in the right place here, guys. He wants them to actually live out their commitment to God in keeping the Sabbath holy and setting aside that time for them to worship and praise the name of God. And so he gets involved. He shuts the gates down. He tells the merchants, don't you dare come back here on the Sabbath day, or something bad's going to happen to you. In that phrase, I will lay hands on you. He's going to throw them out, whatever he has in mind. They get the message and they stop coming. And so then what follows is this purification that takes place in verse 22. Then I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come and guard the gates to keep the Sabbath day holy. So now he gets leaders in worship involved in taking care of this problem. Hey, you also join me in standing at these gates and make sure that the Sabbath day is kept holy. And then he concludes with this prayer that's very similar to the one he prayed in the last section. Remember this also in my favor, O my God, and spare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love. So in one sense, he's saying, if I've done this with a wrong attitude or with a wrong heart, spare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love. Let me understand and experience forgiveness if I've done this with a wrong motive or with a wrong attitude. And on the flip side, at the beginning of that little prayer, he says, remember this also in my favor, oh my God. Lord, I truly am seeking to do this in honor of your name and for your glory and not mine alone. Look, this is a serious thing for Nehemiah. On behalf of the people of Israel, they must obey. It is what they are called to do. They are to spend time in worshiping God. And as I've said before, so as we put some application to this text here, as we draw this to a close this morning, we need to ask ourselves, yes, we don't exercise a Sabbath per se, but yet the question remains, do we set aside time to worship the Lord? Are we faithful in our Bible reading? Are we consistent in our church attendance? Are we being faithful to the Lord as he has commanded us to do? Even as New Testament believers, that is a calling on our lives to bring God glory, to spend time with him in worship. And we live in such a modern age where we're so easily distracted, are we not? We could make up some of the same excuses that the nation's making. Sunday is a great opportunity for us to maybe make more money or do the things we didn't get to do over the weekend, the personal projects or just the leisurely activities and so forth. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, are we willing to let those things take priority over the worship of God? Do we profane our calling to gather as a body of faith on a weekly basis and worship the Lord together, to spend personal time in worship and worshiping God on our own? Do we profane those things because we, like the Israelites, look at all of the titillating things around us, the resources, the circumstances, the money, the pleasures, and I'm not talking about immoral things, guys. I'm talking about normal things that we can all enjoy that are probably very good for us. Yet when they take a priority over the worship of God, they've now become the problem. So let's ask ourselves, are we being faithful? Do we say one thing with our mouths, like the Israelites did? We will commit to A, B, or C. But then by our actions, then by the things that we do, we realistically convey the exact opposite. May we not show that hypocritical behavior in our lives, but rather glorify God in obediently living out the commands in our lives. It's for our benefit, and it is ultimately to the glory of God. Friends, thanks so much for joining me this morning, and I'll look forward to sharing more with you as we wrap things up next time.